Okay, started.
Μπορούμε να ξεκινήσουμε.
There is no banner.
We can start now.
Okay, good evening, everybody, or good morning to the other side of the Atlantic. This is an extraordinary meeting today in the middle of international turmoil. And I would like to welcome all our participants in this panel, all of them being members of our Ukrainian Orthodox Reconciliation Project, coming from different jurisdictions. And I would like to remind that this series of events concerns the unity of the one Church of Christ. And I would like immediately to give the floor to the coordinator of this event, who will introduce the main speaker, a good friend of mine from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, with whom we were 3 years ago together, being myself guest to his faculty. And please, Professor Bortnyk, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, so dear brothers in Christ, I suppose we have till now no sisters in our meeting. Today we have a seminar and especially a lecture of Professor Andrii Krawchuk. Andrii Krawchuk is professor of the University of Sudbury in Canada, and he is specialist in the Ukrainian church policy, church history, and he has written some articles and even books about the Ukrainian church, especially Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And he is also, for example, editor of some books together with Thomas Bremer on Ukrainian situation, church situation. And now we have his lecture, and the title is Orthodox-Catholic Relations in Ukraine, Diagnosis, Goals and Strategies. And I hope that we will listen to an interesting lecture, and after that we can ask some questions. For example, I have some already after I have read the written form of this lecture. Thank you very much. The floor is yours, Professor Krawchuk.
Thank you very much, Professor Bortnyk. Thank you also, first of all, to Professor Vasiliadis for the very kind invitation. to this important lecture series. I am very honored to be here. Thank you also to Professor Bortnyk. Professor Augustinos, I have to ask where to put the accent on your name. I'm not sure, I'm guessing Bairactaris, but I could be wrong. Is it Bairactaris?
Or Bairactaris in the end.
Bairactaris, okay. I was thinking more in the Ukrainian pronunciation. I'm not sure with Bayrak, we have a Bayrak in Ukrainian. And also thank you to Professor Mainardi for participating in this session. As Professor Bortnyk mentioned, I have been working on the churches in Ukraine and religions in Ukraine as well. Apart from an article that I wrote some 5 years ago on the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I've been really drawn into the study of Orthodoxy in Ukraine, especially since 2014, for reasons that you may well understand. I have also worked on other religions in Ukraine and also on the question of interreligious dialogue in Russia as well as in Ukraine. So I welcome today the opportunity to try for the first time to say or contribute something to the ecumenical Orthodox-Catholic discussion, which of course is very closely connected to the evolving situation in Ukraine and which has attracted global attention. My focus here is on the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Ukrainian the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Like the Roman Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, they have representation and are active members on the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations in Ukraine. But unlike the churches of Rome and Moscow, they do not have direct representation on the international Orthodox Catholic dialogues. And so as I've been reflecting about their potential contributions, the contributions of these two churches to ecumenism, it became apparent, or it seemed to me, that they can do much on the home front, that is, in Ukraine. This reflection has been and is still a work in progress. And President Vassiliadis was saying, well, maybe he will post my paper. I have already modified the title. And what I'm trying to do is get more precise, get more closely connected to what it is I'm trying to do. What the title is today is Orthodox Catholic Dialogue in Ukraine, not just relations, but the question of Orthodox dialogue with Catholics, challenges, prospects, and approaches. Okay. I'm guessing before I jump into it that I have a little presentation which gives the outline, but I think that most of you have seen the paper, so you have an idea of where I'm going. Basically, I will mention briefly the three sections. I think I can dispense with the PowerPoint. Is that okay with everybody? We don't need to do that. Just a final preliminary remark that, of course, my own background is in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but I'm not, presenting here as an official representative. The views that I am trying to formulate are my own. So the emergence of Uniatism as an urgent priority of Catholic Orthodox dialogue in the early 1990s coincided with the legalization of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in 1989, Ukraine's independence, and the USSR's collapse in 1991. The rehabilitation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church alarmed the Russian Orthodox Church because it initiated a catastrophic exodus of its members in Ukraine. After the first wave for the Ukrainian Greek Catholics from the Russian Orthodox Church, There were two other waves in 1992 and since then in 2019 after the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So for 3 decades, a paradigm shift or a tectonic shift has been taking place in Ukraine's religious landscape, which is closely tied to this continuing post-Soviet transformation. In broad strokes, this is the setting in which Balamand, the meeting and the statement that was issued in 1993 and related international Catholic Orthodox initiatives may be properly understood and critically assessed, namely the context of the rapid decline of Russian Orthodoxy in independent Ukraine. By ignoring this context or not attending to it sufficiently and subscribing instead to an agenda of religious hegemony in Ukraine, Catholic Orthodox dialogues failed, I would say, to produce significant results. And so I will be beginning with a discussion of their shortcomings, and these shortcomings were noted. I appreciate the contribution of Professor Vassiliadis, who noted that it was not only critics of Balamand who spoke up, but also Catholic and Orthodox leaders and ecumenists as well, who spoke about some of the issues with the Balamand document. So there's 3 parts that I'm presenting here: the shortcomings and misconceptions of international dialogues. And the effort here is not just to criticize, but to look for constructive responses. Secondly, I want to assess the prospects of local ecumenical initiatives by 2 churches, the ones I mentioned, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which I believe share a natural affinity, even if we were told previously that there is not at the present time a dialogue between them. I think there are strong grounds, there's a strong basis for these churches in Ukraine to have productive conversations. And finally, in the third part, I propose 5 guidelines for what I call local ecumenism, something that might promote fraternal Catholic Orthodox relations in Ukraine, and possibly contribute to reconciliation on the international stage. So, problems of Catholic Orthodox dialogue and the case of Ukraine. It is much to the credit of the direct participants of the Catholic Orthodox dialogue that they acknowledged a number of shortcomings in the process. Those insights that they have given to us provide valuable clues to something that was missing from the dialogues. And I, again, credit to Professor Vassiliadis, who has reminded us of 2 of them. The first one is Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras, who was frustrated with the lack of tangible ecumenical progress by theologians because he felt that their speculations about the nature of truth were largely exercises in abstraction with few practical incomes. Instead of that dialogue of truth, which was mired in conflicting truth claims, the Patriarch was convinced that a meeting of hearts, or as he put it, a dialogue of love between church leaders could be more effective. For Athenagoras, the goal of Catholic Orthodox unity was not so much about harmonizing doctrinal propositions as it was about healing and restoring fraternal relations among Christians. Ecumenical initiatives that pursued the former goal, reconciling truth claims, might produce some consensus statements, but it would not necessarily overcome the schism itself. And the second observation from the Catholic side was expressed by Father Taft. In order to succeed, the international Catholic Orthodox dialogue requires a preliminary step, he says, a purification and healing of memories by all the members of the churches. So Taft was basically agreeing with Patriarch Athenagoras. Something vitally important was missing in the theological approaches to dialogue. That something, the healing of memories, was a connection with the reality on the ground. An effective ecumenical theology had to be rooted in the human social contexts, the real places where Catholic Orthodox separation was embedded in lived experience, in unresolved traumas of history, and transmitted memory narratives. The vitally important contextual work of purifying and healing those memories was beyond the reach of international ecumenical dialogues, but unless it was done first, those encounters would be reduced potentially to abstraction that was disconnected from intergenerational wounds and grievances. Now, coming from inside the dialogues, these practical criticisms were intended as constructive corrections. And in order to produce worthwhile results, ecumenical theology could not afford to ignore human hearts, not just the mind, but the heart, and social contexts, and had to attend to those. And following up on these insights, what I'd like to do is note a few further shortcomings of the Catholic Orthodox dialogues, particularly with reference to the problem of uniatism, or so-called problem of uniatism, as it was formulated at Balamand and in meetings leading up to and following it. The Balamand document sought to address Orthodox concerns about uniatism. The Catholic delegation heard those concerns and conceded that uniatism can no longer be accepted as either as a method to be followed or as a model of the unity our churches are seeking. But at the same time, they were duty-bound to disappoint anyone who was seeking to terminate the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church once and for all. They knew very well Rome's obligations toward the Greek Catholic churches, with which it is in full communion. They may also have been mindful how fickle Ukrainian uniates could be in their allegiance whenever the Vatican unilaterally altered any part of its standing agreement with them. And I mentioned in the footnote the transfer from Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church to the Orthodox over the question of married priesthood in North America and so on. Now, along with the rejection of uniatism as an acceptable method of unification, there was also the controversial affirmation of that the Eastern Catholic churches have a right to exist. Now, in order to reassure Eastern Catholics, who would be surprised perhaps to discover that the method of their unification with Rome was no longer acceptable, something more had to be said, even at risk of displeasing others. The right to exist formula, in fact, resolved nothing and only compounded the procedural errors. Some critics took the statement to suggest that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was not previously a legitimate church. But the deeper issue was the exclusion and objectification of an ecclesial partner, in effect amounting, I would say, to a negation of existing communion by the Catholic side, or at least calling it into question. The Roman Catholic ecumenists were not authorized to revoke unilaterally the 1596 bilateral agreement of unification between the Vatican and the Kievan Metropolitan. If the Holy See had wished to review and consider the terms of the Union of Brest, its proper dialogue partner would have been the present-day heirs of the Union of Brest, the Ukrainian Greek Catholics. In any event, the whole method of exclusion that characterized the Balamand process called for serious scrutiny. If the Vatican determined that there was something truly wrong or unacceptable about the form of unification accomplished at Brest, then the proper conversation would be between the co-signatories and not third parties. All in all, Balamand seemed to be placing UGCC, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, in the untenable position of an object of discussion, rather than as the sui juris, autonomous, ecclesial subject that it presumably is, along with the other Greek Catholic churches. For 3 decades before the achievement of Orthodox autocephaly in 2019, an image was projected to the world of Ukraine as a country in religious turmoil, a hotbed of schism that defied efforts at peace and unity. the information campaign presented a failed state and a chaotic religious landscape, a problem in need of solutions. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, its citizens had become accustomed to such messaging, and for them there was no mystery about its source, where it came from, and the objectives, where it was going. While they celebrated their independence, they knew that for some Russians, the end of the USSR was a catastrophe. In addition, the Russian Orthodox in Ukraine the church was shaken to the core by a massive exodus that continues to this day. The exodus from Russian Orthodoxy comprised three waves, and I run through them. I've mentioned them briefly at the beginning. The Greek Catholic Church, then the Kievan Patriarchate in 1992, of course, and then 2018, the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And what is at stake for the Russian Orthodox Church is not only its majority predominance in Ukraine, of course, but its aspirations in world Orthodoxy too. With its not quite autocephalous branch in Ukraine, that is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, in an ever less tenable situation in Ukraine, and with Ukrainian society consolidated as never before by Russia's military aggression in Crimea and Donbass, the Moscow Patriarchate launched a campaign to reverse the tide, or try to reverse the tide of political and religious change. In ecumenical dialogues and public relations efforts, a wide range of concepts and arguments were marshaled in support of restoring the old order, or some part of it at least. Ruski Mir, canonical territory, uncanonical churches, Slavic unity, and of course the spiritual legacy of Kievan Byzantine Christianity, the common heritage of Christians in Ukraine. Considering the powerful influence of Russia's geopolitical priorities, the international dialogue, Catholic Orthodox, was unable to produce an accurate analysis of the Catholic Orthodox situation in Ukraine. In an assembly where nowhere else had a firm grounding in the history and social reality of Ukraine, the default became a hegemonic agenda of dominance in the canonical territory of the Russian Orthodox Church. For its part, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was excluded from discussion that centered on Eastern Catholics in independent Ukraine, denied a voice and agency, and reduced to the status of an object of ecumenism. Before coming to the enumeration of different approaches that are worth considering for Catholic Orthodox dialogues in Ukraine, I have an intermediate section that mentions a couple of hopeful signs, which I think allow us to consider the possibilities and the potential of Catholic Orthodox dialogues in Ukraine. So the shortcomings of the international dialogues were not a dead end. By pointing out lacunae, the ecumenists and the participants themselves brought to light new opportunities and hopeful signs. I would maintain, as I reread and reread again the Balaman statement, that it actually permits an irenic reading, much more so than what one might initially expect from an Eastern Catholic or Uniate perspective. In the first place, there's nothing wrong with setting aside a 16th century method of ecclesiastical unification, because the premises on which it was based and justified in its time are no longer acceptable. We do the same thing with obsolescence that applies today without controversy to slavery, the Crusades, and most recently in the Orthodox context to fundamentalism, which the Pan-Orthodox Council in Crete condemned in 2016. Secondly, Ukrainian Catholics really, to be honest, do not spend much time worrying about their right to exist. along with the entire Balaman statement, the controversial, irksome right to exist provision was probably intended not as a message to Eastern Rite Catholics, but as an emphatic contradiction to anyone who might have imagined that as a result of these dialogues, uniates can somehow be removed from the picture, from the Catholic communion. That's not in the cards. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is close, so second hopeful sign, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's closest dialogue partner in Ukraine is the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, with which it shares, I would say, a natural affinity. Significant portions of both churches have a living memory of the Russian Orthodox Church's jurisdiction. We remember that not all of the Greek Catholic clergy and laity were in the underground. Some of them were part of the Russian Orthodox Church. They, of course, returned after the legalization. Since its restoration, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church developed good relations with both of the Orthodox churches that united in 2018 to form the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And as the granting of autocephaly came nearer, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church publicly supported, welcomed, and then celebrated the achievement as a great event. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine's canonical ties also to the ecumenical patriarchate have given the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church an opportunity for substantive contacts with an Orthodox jurisdiction that is sensitive to the historical complexities of Christianity in Ukraine and is not encumbered by geopolitical aspirations or considerations. The goal of this local dialogue between the Greek Catholics and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine can be modest. In fact, I think it should be modest. And keeping in mind the experience and lessons of the international dialogues, it can steer clear of any illusions or impressions of structural unification, absorption, or fusion. All of these things have been excluded, by the international dialogues. But building on existing multilateral cooperation, which is already in place in the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, and the mutual respect which already exists between the Greek Catholics and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, I would say, and their natural affinity, is an achievable long-term goal that can strengthen the fraternal ties between them. Without competing with the higher authorities, the international dialogues, and the pursuit of, ultimately communion, the two Ukrainian churches can address matters of shared interest locally, learn more about each other through bilateral encounters, and pool resources together in cases of common cause. The modest goal of strong fraternal relations can have far-reaching long-term outcomes in the home front and for potentially the international dialogues too. So we come to the final section where I enumerate the five, struggling with a term, whether it's principles or approaches. I've calling them now 5 orientations for contextual or local Catholic Orthodox dialogue in Ukraine. The first point is ecumenism by particular churches in local contexts. Local efforts of ecumenism are legitimate and necessary. We know this because the participants of the official international Catholic Orthodox dialogue have clearly indicated that they need to ground their discussions in the reality of the local contexts. Catholic and Orthodox theologies have also affirmed the value of local decentralized input to ecclesial governance and decision-making. While senior hierarchical structures, the patriarchates and so forth, still take the lead in the efforts of reconciliation, their delegation of responsibilities to local churches, bishops, and laity can reinforce unity and resonate with the democratization and the processes of democratization in the public sphere. Such constructive best practices can promote local initiatives while avoiding micromanagement and paternalism. And I give a number of examples there from the Orthodox tradition, Afanasiev, Zizioulas, and Ware, Khomyakov as well, speaking about the reciprocity of laity and bishops, and the idea of sobornost, which includes this dimension of decentralization. Similarly, I mention in the Catholic tradition the idea of subsidiarity as a principle that applies not only to the economic sphere, but also to governance, and possibly, in this case, to ecumenical efforts, that the summit, the highest levels of church authority do their part, but they also rely and ask for repeatedly input from the local level. So this is what is not something that is completely new. Orthodox and Catholic theologies have been thinking about this principle of decentralization from different perspectives for a long time. In setting its goals, the Catholic dialogue, Orthodox dialogue in Ukraine would not compete with or duplicate the work of international dialogues. Any questions of unification and communion would be left to are left to the highest authorities, but local issues are within the specific competence of local churches rather than of Rome, Constantinople, or Moscow. The highest, for example, the highest authorities can respond to the Russian-Ukrainian war in general terms at a certain safe distance, but local churches and communities are the on-site eyewitnesses of daily human suffering, and they can also detect opportunities for meaningful Christian response, pastoral response, and so forth, and theological. They can bring a voice and a heart that are contextually informed and attuned to the immediate pastoral situation. Given adequate opportunities and support, they may articulate theological insights that benefit their own communities through clarification and so forth, and perhaps the international communion as well. Occasionally, they may be called to provide spiritual support without discriminating against someone who is of perhaps another denomination or jurisdiction. In responding to spiritual needs, they may discover forms of Catholic Orthodox collaboration that will increase the effectiveness of each other's work and promote fraternal Catholic Orthodox relations. Secondly, I believe, was it Father Bortnyk in your presentation last time at, there was a question during the discussion about self-critical principle or a self-critical thing. So I did some thinking about that, and I think it is, in fact, a very important element. I've encountered it in interreligious dialogue, and I think it certainly plays a role in Catholic Orthodox dialogues. So taking up Father Taft's suggestion about the purification and healing of memories, effective ecumenism requires a preliminary step, a local encounter that will inform and ground subsequent dialogues in the human context and the social reality. If we talk about the war in Ukraine, if we talk about uniatism in Ukraine, then that context needs to be looked at directly. That preliminary local Catholic Orthodox exchange requires methodical preparation. It cannot employ self-serving, pre-critical narratives of triumph or victimization. We need to distance ourselves from that critically, from received narratives of innocence and involuntary defense reflexes. That becomes possible when we step back and scrutinize our own community identity through an ethical lens, that is, in maybe spiritual terms, an examination of conscience. In order to heal memories and reconcile competing historical narratives, the impulse to self-justify and to vilify the other, the easy way out, must be set aside and replaced by a new self-awareness, recalibrated through the practice of humility. A new narrative of the transfigured moral self, a new narrative that comes from the transfigured moral self, presents the proximate neighbor with a clear signal. One has come to the table of truth and reconciliation with a purified mind and heart and a new moral vocabulary. The actual forms of self-critical introspection will vary, of course, in different contexts, in different cases, as will their transformative outcomes. There are no shortcuts or terminology that can substitute for the actual purified, authentic self. Perhaps the only other way to illustrate what the critical, self-critical step can look like is with examples, and I cite the example from Professor Vassiliadis, who quoted Father John Erickson, and I quote, "We are inclined to forget atrocities in which we ourselves have been complicit, such as the forced suppression of Eastern Catholic churches during the communist period in Russia and Eastern Europe." Similarly, Father Cyril Oborun drew upon his extensive ecumenical experience as a representative of the Russian Orthodox Church. A self-critical perspective enabled him to enumerate specific shortcomings that troubled him from a moral standpoint. His testimony was in the form of an apology to the dialogue partners. In these dialogues, we, the Orthodox, often behave in a way for which I should apologize. We do not always respect agreements that we have commonly reached. We refuse to recognize our own faults and to acknowledge the merits of the other side. We solve particular issues of our jurisdictions under the guise of protecting the common tradition. Our partners in the dialogue need to have steel nerves to bear with us. Ukrainian Greek Catholic Metropolitan Andrii Sheptytsky, in an earlier time, his years are 1965 to 44, also understood the value of a self-critical attitude and the difficulties that arose when it was absent. In his view, Ukrainian Catholics, his own flock, suffered from that lacuna in their inclination towards emotional expressions of patriotism. And I quote that, and he states very flatly that any patriotism that is, I'm thinking about another quote. I'll just read this one. "Indeed, this patriotism always lacks self-criticism. We measure patriotism not with our minds, but with our hearts. Hearts in another sense, from what Patriarch Athanagoras was talking about. In our view, its temperature overshadows any other trait. For many years, we have not had a free press that was not in constant struggle against national adversaries. All these factors stand in the way of self-criticism. In many ways, we are still a primitive people for whom demonstrations, slogans, and noise appear more important than cool, calm deliberation and dedicated work." So for those who may be unfamiliar with the spiritual and ethical dimensions of dialogue, or who are invested in grand tales of triumph or sanctimonious victimization, the self-critical posture may appear to be futile or a sign of weakness. Yet the transformative dialogue of truth and reconciliation is a voluntary commitment of the willing who clearly understand its challenges and benefits. I should probably intervene and ask or interrupt briefly. I have a few more points. Just want to ask about the time, because I see we're close to the hour here. We did start a little later. Can you tell me if what the time looks like for you? We want to have some time for discussion.
I personally suppose you can read more. So you have maybe not really much text. That's why we need you need maybe 10 minutes. I hope it is enough.
Yes, I think I can do
enough
that.
time.
Yes, I should be able to do it. Yeah. So the third approach or principle that I have done some thinking about is church-state relations, and I call it letting go of Symphonia. And there's a logical follow-through or segue from the self-critical step, which applies not only to the past, looking at history and healing memories, but it also looks at questions of the present and the future. And so along with promoting moral transformation and correcting errors, coming to the dialogue with a new heart, the self-critical step, I think, can also inform our ecclesiological thinking. And what is, in particular, the relationship of the church to the state. As churches that unequivocally support the Ukrainian side in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, the Ukrainian Greek Catholics and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine face fundamental options in the relationship with the independent Ukrainian state. Simply put, they will have to choose between two paths, either coexisting on a par with diverse religious neighbors in a pluralistic Ukraine, or vying for the preferential status and a special partnership with the state. Regarding the latter, preferential partner, the concept of Symphonia is very well known and has some currency in informal settings and discussions, while formal venues such as the All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations have used the term and referred to a partnership with the state in its published documents. Comprised in part of former members of the Russian Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian churches that I'm talking about, Greek Catholic and Orthodox Church of Ukraine, value their ecclesiastical independence from Moscow. In renouncing that past association, they renewed ties with other centers, Greek Catholics with Rome, Orthodox Church of Ukraine with Constantinople. Both churches have embarked on a process of consolidating their ecclesial identities in distinction, contradistinction to the Russian Orthodox Church. Their single-minded focus on difference, doing things differently, is directed towards profound dedication to hammer out a distinctive ecclesial ethos, and not simply a Ukrainian-speaking mirror image of the Russian Orthodox, the Russian state church. And I talk about this more in the full version of the paper. Church-state separation holds advantages that merit their consideration, the consideration of these two churches, preventing the instrumentalization of the churches or their submission to political agendas, the preservation of their free speech, and free agency, not dependent on the state, in the public forum, including the possibility of criticizing unjust laws or policies, the protection of religious equality and anti-discrimination provisions, and the pursuit on their own initiative of fraternal solidarity and cooperation among religious communities. Such goals are consistent with the wider processes in society, like democratization, whereas a state church model could potentially undermine them. Both the Ukrainian Greek Catholic and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine seek to be different from a co-opted church that operates as a branch of the state, follows directives, and submits to the geopolitical project of Ruski Mir. Neither church wants any part of this, yet the alluring image of the so-called Symphonia with the state can lead precisely to such forms, exactly the same forms of subordination, voluntary, not coerced. And it's worth remembering that in the Russian journey, Nihilus of Sora warned of the risk of comfortable arrangements with the state. But it was the opposite position of Joseph Volokolamsk that it won the day and laid the groundwork for the future, championing the monarchy, theocracy, and the Third Rome in its time. The Ukrainian churches have an opportunity to contribute to democratization if they maintain their autonomy in the public sphere. Fourth, saying no to ecclesiastical nationalism. So in addition to the international Orthodox dialogues, Catholic Orthodox dialogues, inter-Orthodox meetings can also be a source for identifying matters of interest to this local dialogue that we're talking about here and its practical reflection. One such pressing issue is philitism or ethno-nationalism in Christian communities. We recall that in 2016, the Pan-Orthodox Council of Crete was hampered in its work by the boycott launched by the Russian Orthodox Church and its three allies, the churches of Antioch, Bulgaria, and Georgia. Archbishop Chrysostomos II of Cyprus was troubled by the lack of solidarity at inter-Orthodox rivalries, which obstructed the council and prevented inclusion of pressing matters like autocephaly. He attributed the root cause to philitism. And the Council of Crete reinforced its original condemnation of the Council of Constantinople in 1872 and pronounced philitism a heresy. Whereas the earlier assembly, 1872, chastised the Bulgarian church, Cyril Hovorun argues that this recent declaration of the Council of Crete, declaration of philitism as a heresy, was aimed specifically at the Russian church's ideology of Ruski Mir. Ever since 1872, when the problem was first named and condemned by the Orthodox Church, ethno-religious fusion of various forms has been debated in Orthodox communities. In Ukraine, the matter is of interest also to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, of course, Orthodox Church of Ukraine. In the ongoing conflict with Russia, both can potentially be pulled into a simple binary opposition of pro-Ukrainian versus Russophobic sentiments, self-justification and demonization of the neighbor, and of silent consent or vocal support for the war, but not moral outrage, not raising the moral question of the war itself. In his time, Metropolitan Sheptytsky addressed nationalist extremism as a threat to Christian patriotism, to social unity and the church. Well aware of efforts to mobilize church support for nationalism and to subsume scriptural teachings under the banner of secular constructions, he sided unequivocally with the Christian option. If the mutual, I quote, if the mutual love among Christians were to require or permit hatred of enemies, such love would not be a sufficient basis for national unity. The love of one's own, combined with hatred for all others, is pagan patriotism. So both the Ukrainian Greek Catholic and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine have a common stake in avoiding the risk of ecclesiastical nationalism. If they allowed national sentiments to escalate without restraint, that could potentially lead to populism and philitism and ultimately subvert the urgently needed work for ecclesial consolidation and unity. Identity narratives that are devoid of critical reasoning can produce ecclesiastical distinctiveness, but one which is only illusory. Unless they attend closely to what they are doing, the Ukrainian churches can become ethnic alter egos of the entity, the neighbor to the north. The road to an authentic ecclesial alternative way may take years or decades to design and implement, but it begins with a fundamental option, a determined decision not to allow the clannish or tribal instinct to prevail and to shape the character and values of these two churches. In this, they have common cause and a solid basis for constructive dialogue and cooperation. If there's another name for this section, we could call it No to Russophobia as well. And the final section has to do with continuing openness to dialogue with Russian Orthodoxy. I think this is fundamental, despite the fact that I'm talking about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the prospects of their dialogue. The elephant in the room, the biggest church in town, in the country, is the the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and we need to think about the perspective eventually of dialogues that have been tried, and I enumerate here some signals that at the very least such future dialogue is conceivable, is possible. And this is because the shared history of neighbors is seldom simply black or white. There is an opportunity in Ukraine to recover and reflect on instances of peaceful coexistence, mutual respect, and goodwill. Previous studies have enumerated subtle indications that not all Russian Orthodox and not all Soviets had done everything they could to eradicate every last trace of Ukrainian Catholicism. With the return of St. George's Cathedral from the Russian Orthodox Church to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Lviv, its underground crypt was examined and found to contain the remains of Metropolitan Andrii Sheptitsky, the arch enemy of the whole Soviet period, the polemics and so on. There he was, untouched, duly verified and authenticated. Through all the Soviet years, the relics had remained intact. Similarly, extensive archives of the Greek Catholic Church, confiscated by the regime, ordered destroyed, were instead meticulously cataloged and largely preserved. Other little-known items include the 1991 statement by then still Metropolitan Kirill of Smolensk, who later became Patriarch. The quote is, "It is not our church, but Stalin who banned the Uniates. I was always convinced that when our public life was normalized, the Uniates would certainly have the right to exist." Now, of course, in that interview, Metropolitan Kirill was speaking in the middle of a political thaw. This was 1991. It was a brief period during which such statements were possible. In the present conjuncture today of geopolitical and internal church dynamics, it is not yet realistic. We cannot expect anything of the sort today. Nevertheless, dialogue with the Russian Orthodox Church, whether the neighbor in Russia we're talking about or affiliates in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, should remain a long-term goal of the Ukrainian churches. The above examples suggest that with the passage of time, as new facts come to light and gradually dissolve the geopolitical, ideological, or psychological obstacles to truth, a climate of dialogue and reconciliation may appear and allow categorical judgments of the past to be revised and memories to be healed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your lecture. And I suppose that now we have possibility for two participants of our discussion. Reverend Professor Augustinos Bairactaris, maybe you can start your reflections on this theme and on the lecture you have heard.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Krawchuk, for your very informative and interesting presentation that you had and you shared that with us. Just I would like to ask you whether, how do you understand plurality of conventional positions in dispute with each other about the legacy of the one tradition? In this approach, unity is about the mutual recognition and reconciliation. And how easy or even how close do you think churches are to achieve that?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, can I get you to speak closer to the microphone because it's not very clear?
I'm sorry. Can you listen to me better now?
Yes, it's a little better, yes.
Okay. So I was saying, if you just give us your perspective, how do you understand plurality of conventional positions in dispute with each other about the legacy of the one tradition with capital T? And this approach, unity, is about the mutual recognition and reconciliation. And how easy or even how close do you think churches are to achieve that? And in regard to this, what is the role of the Greek Catholics? And another question is, why has the issue of Christian unity, according to your perspective, do you think why it has become so complex and confusing, Christian unity nowadays? And my third position is that I don't know how bold this opinion would sound, but just I have the feeling that we could approach, in a sense, the term of schism as a sort of communication without communicating Jesus to each other. But still, there are some bonds of unity unbroken, remaining as bridges of dialogue between the historical churches. So these bonds are manifold: sincere devotion, the word of God, the grace of God, and whichever heals the grace of God, whichever heals the weak and supplies what is lacking, as we say during the ordination of presbytery. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do you want me to respond individually?
Yes, if possible.
Okay. I honestly have to say that I had some difficulty with the sound and was not able to perfectly understand all of it. But I think the first thing you were asking about is the plurality of confessional positions and the legacy of one tradition. So I think actually this is one of the factors that partially answers your question towards the end about why things are so complex. Of course, when you look at the history of Christianity in Ukraine, it begins with one tradition. It's the Byzantine tradition that came to Kiev, and it was undivided. The first division, I don't need to go through the whole history for you, but that's part of the historical complexity, is that the first division that occurred, the division between East and West, was not something that directly involved people, the Christians of Ukraine. They simply, by virtue of the geographic distinction between Rome, East and West, Rome and Constantinople, found themselves on the eastern side. So this was just a fact of life. Later, the Uniates, I don't know, you were asking about the role of the Uniate Church. Well, of course, it's not for me to determine or to answer the question of what they feel their role is. It's the bishops and so forth. I think theologians try to make sense of the history and try to, in this case, the question of ecumenism, I have tried to consider what concretely, not theoretically, in practice, in practical terms, what can the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, what does it have in common with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine? Well, one of the things is that they both come in very recent times. A lot of their members were members of the Russian Orthodox Church. There are priests of the Greek Catholic Church, there are priests of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine who studied in Moscow, Leningrad, and those seminaries. Okay, there are people, especially in the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, who have friendships, who have maybe family in the Church of the Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. So there's direct connections, you know, that exist, and I think that one of the very intriguing factors, which I call the natural affinity of these two churches. It's not something that they have. This is a term that I coined. I think is the relationship that the Orthodox Church of Ukraine has with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. This has deep historical roots. Ukrainian Catholics were Orthodox historically. Before they became Catholic, they were Orthodox. And which tradition was that? It was the Byzantine tradition. So the Patriarch of Constantinople is not a stranger in their history. He's an integral part of that history. Now, of course, there would be a very different interpretation of history and what should be done and what is right from the point of view of Russian Orthodoxy. So there's debates about what is the way to do it. And we have Balaman, which tells us that the kind of union that was achieved in the 16th century, which created the Uniates, the Uniate Church of Ukraine, is not a method that is acceptable anymore. So we accept that and go forward. But as I said, all of the criticism that some Orthodox, I think not all Orthodox are critical of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. There are deep relationships, friendships, personal, individual, and there is not a basic kind of antipathy, especially today in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. I think there's in terms of political sentiments and the sentiments of supporting an independent Ukraine and its borders, I think those churches, and in fact, many of the people in the Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, there would be people who would support that. I've met bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate who opposed the war, the original war that started in 2014, and who came out publicly. I don't know if I'm answering your questions, but I tried to address the question of complexity. I can go into the complexity, in fact, I do in the full version of my paper, but that's part of the difficulty of even trying to put together a paper like this. You can get lost. You can literally get lost in the complexity of it. And the challenge is to try to bring ideas in a coherent way that somehow accommodate the complexity without getting lost in it. I don't know if I answered, the questions about the diversity of confessional positions. I think what I was trying to say there, and what I'm trying to address in the paper, has to do with the way that the religious landscape has been forming in Ukraine since its independence. So the Constitution guarantees the rights for all of these different communities. For the laws of Ukraine, there was no problem that there was the autocephalous Orthodox Church. There was no problem that there was 3 different Orthodox jurisdictions. Canonically, it's a problem. It's questions that the Moscow Patriarchate is raising. They're not canonical, we're canonical. But in the law, all of these communities were, on the same level, equals, and all, in fact, what's very interesting, all are members and participants of the Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations. So in many ways, there is an effort to to achieve this reconciliation and unity and so on. I think that, I'm sorry, there's noise coming in from somewhere. Does somebody have? Somebody has noise, yeah. So there are these efforts to achieve unity. I think one of the ways also that I'm trying to frame this presentation is that the goal of ecumenical dialogues, the local ecumenical dialogues, is not any kind of structural unification, that we leave this to the higher authorities that are responsible for these things. I think that is, in a way, respecting the statement that the forms of unification of the 16th century, the path of uniatism that was followed, is not something that that can happen today. So again, I hope I covered some of your questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Of course, you answered. Just one comment, Sergei, and I will not speak anymore, not to take advantage of your hospitality. To what you said, Professor, regarding the very late ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras, it's very important to see a smooth shift, we could say, in his way of doing ecumenical theology in 50s and 60s. Where in 50s, in his very quite famous encyclical of 1952, he gave specific instructions to the Orthodox representatives at the third, who participated at the Third World Conference on Faith and Order in Lund in Sweden in 1952, where he said that I'm sorry about my voice, where he actually forbade any participation of the Orthodox Church in the discussion and operations of this commission should be avoided, inasmuch as this commission has for its aim the union of churches by means of dogmatic discussion between delegates of churches separated from one another by the deepest issues. But immediately, at the end of this encyclical, you will find out that he prays all together, if it is possible, to pray together in order to praise Jesus, Lord, since he's the one and the same for all Christian churches. And a few years later, all Christianity will witness the lift of anathemas as a manner of healing, as you said, the memories between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, and I appreciate the fact that some of you have far more experience in the history of ecumenism and are sensitive to all of the movement of ideas that has occurred over the years. So I'm learning a lot from the exchange with you as well.
And you know, in 1961, when the first pre-conciliar Pan-Orthodox took place in Rhodes, there it took place the first historical meeting between the Catholics and the Orthodox representatives. And I do remember I had the honor to have as a professor the very late Metropolitan Chrysostomos Konstantinidis, Bishop Metropolitan of Ephesus. So he told me, in a sense of confessing some, let's say, episodes of his life. So he said that during that meeting in Rhodes, we saw all of a sudden, among the participants of the Catholic Church, one Greek Catholic. And when we saw him as Orthodox, immediately we took the decision to withdraw from, even before, you see, before the starting point of the official theological dialogue. So we said, no, it's inappropriate they took it as a gesture of not sincere, let's say, dialogue, because we are in the framework of the dialogue of love. In 1960s, dialogue was not still in the dialogue of truth. So, and the whole Orthodox delegation gathered together. They went to the chapel and they prayed all together to the Holy Person of Virgin Mary to seize this temperature, which was quite high, let's say. And after a quiet time of reflection, contemplation, and prayer, they decided to get back to the main room of the conference and to see the delegates of the other side of the Catholic Church. So their first reaction was negative, seeing a Greek Catholic among the Catholics, because the main argument coming from the Orthodox Church was addressed to the Greek Catholics in Romania and also in Ukraine to decide freely the side whether they would like to be part of, to be part of the Catholic Church or to be part of the Orthodox Church, following at the same time the discipline, the ordo, the sacraments, right? So they would be free to choose, but not to be somewhere in the middle. So in 60s and 70s, for the Orthodox theologians, and namely for the ecumenical patriarchate, the Greek Catholic Church was somewhere in the middle, ecclesiologically speaking, right? So, and they were received as fruits of the proselytism, something which was done in 17th and 18th century. So all this memory, as you correctly said, had to be healed in order to be able to sit at the same table and discuss as normal people to normal people. Into brackets, these normal people, right? Not to be misunderstood. So it's a long and quite complex, the process of doing ecumenical dialogue. It's not an easy task, and certainly it's not like, as the very late professor of mine, Machukas, used to say, it's not to have a picnic in the countryside gathering flowers. You have to give blood and to witness your faith, and this takes also, we have to take in also into consideration that after all, we all praise the same Lord, and it's the Lord who saves us, not this tradition or the other tradition, this church or the other church. So all of us, we have to obey to his final, let's say, commandment during his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Thank you very much. And Professor Sergei, forgive me for some time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I'll just very quickly respond, is that okay?
Of course.
So thank you again for the comments. I think this is indeed something that I've done quite a bit of thinking about. I appreciate the insights from the wider story of ecumenism. I think all the more so, the Ukrainian context is unique because of what I'm calling this natural affinity between an Orthodox church and not just any other. There's a Roman Catholic Church in Ukraine, but they don't have the same connections that the Greek Catholics have. They speak the same language. Their history, their deep history is the same. The deeper you go, it's the same history. Like you said, the one church before it was divided. Also, the more recent history, the connection to the Russian Orthodox Church. They were both under the Soviet Union. Anybody who was in the legal church was sending their son to the Russian Orthodox seminary. So they speak the same language. The liturgy is no different for the Uniates or for the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Exactly the same liturgy for the Church of the Moscow Patriarch. So there's a specific contextuality here, which I think creates opportunities. And again, on the personal level, people know each other, people are friends. One person stayed in the Moscow Patriarchate jurisdiction. The other one joined the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The other one is Greek Catholic today, but they studied in the same place at the same, they were students together, you know. So there's, again, it's an opportunity which can be used, or over time, this natural affinity can be forgotten. If it is not exploited, if it is not used, then I think there is an opportunity that could be missed. There's still goodwill, there's still family connections, there's, you know, all of these things that maybe do not exist in the same way in other contexts. So it's an interesting thing, but of course the churches must decide for themselves how this will happen. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. As coordinator, I would like to invite Dr. Adalberto Mainardi as participant of our discussion, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, and particularly thank to Professor Krawchuk for his paper, for having considered so closely the reality of the present and the importance of history, and met these challenges with also some signs of hope. I am very happy that he managed to do all this in a very difficult and complicated issue. I will have just 3 remarks generally on his paper. One is about the partner of the dialogue, the concern he has about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church as a real partner of the ecumenical dialogue, the first remark. The second remark is the healing of memories, and in this regard I will have some remark about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the final point, some more consideration about the local level, ecumenism at the grassroots level in Ukraine in the context of Ukrainian Church. The first remark, he, I think rightly, points out some shortcomings of the Catholic Orthodox dialogue concerning uniatism, and particularly of Balamand. And what is the core of this shortcoming? The fact that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was not a partner, a real partner of that dialogue. It has also some historical reason. Balamand was at the time when the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was just recovering itself from a long captivity. But we can but agree when Professor Krawchuk says that Balamand placed the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in an untenable position of an object of discussion rather than as an autonomous ecclesial subject. Of course, Balamand was in general about uniatism, not in particular about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. But I think that in some ways, the Orthodox Catholic dialogue should envisage the possibility of having the, in brackets, unite churches as a partner. Because other ways will not be possible to have a real healing of memories. We cannot speak in general of healing of memories, but in concrete cases. And the Ukrainian history gives us examples, and still gives us this kind of examples of necessity of healing memories there was a blessure, there was a problem. This is my second remark. When the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was suppressed by Stalin, and rightly Professor Krawchuk reminded that also Patriarch Kirill, when he was Metropolitan, said that this was wrong. It was wrongdoing of Stalin, and it was not the church that suppressed the Greek Catholics, but was Stalin. And this is still a problem, but and yet it is a healing of memory when we have to reconcile also what happened after the restoring of Greek Catholic Church. There was a conflict with the other parishes belonging to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is part of the Moscow Patriarchate. And in this regards, I have a remark, because if we have to give the real status of a partner to the Greek Catholic Church of Ukrainian in the Ukrainian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church, so we do not have to forget, we have to keep in mind that also the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is a partner in this dialogue that is almost forgotten. We call it a Russian Orthodox Church because it is part of the Moscow Patriarchate, but in fact is an autonomous church inside the Moscow Patriarchate. And I think that a process of autonomy or autocephaly or different churches should have included in another way also the Ukrainian Orthodox Church regarding the process that led to the tomos of autocephaly. So on one part, this tomos was a healing for a schism, but on the other part was the beginning of another schism. And it was a sort of the same thing that happened with Uniatism, that on one part, the Union of Brest was the healing of the schism of, say, 1054, because there was a recognition of the union with Rome on the basis of Florence. It was that the theology. But on the other part, it was another schism with the Orthodox Church, another blessure. So this is the method of Uniatism in brackets. So we do not have to heal one schism creating another schism. And what could be the way out? I think that Professor Krawchuk has a hint to this possibility when he speaks about the local level. This is the final remark. The Eucharistic theology. We should bear in mind that the origin of the, so to say, Metropolitan of Kiev, the autonomy, it was under the jurisdiction of Constantinople. In 1687, the Patriarch of Constantinople, due to the fact that it was impossible to appoint a metropolitan in Kiev, gave this possibility to the Patriarch of Moscow. So it was not just a jurisdictional controversy, but a pastoral problem. If we take seriously the Eucharistic context of the commemoration during the Anaphora, we can see in 1686 what was the reality. The local church of Kiev, in communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople, because he was remembered first in the Anaphora, was also in communion with the Patriarch of Moscow as an elder bishop who ordained the metropolitans of Kiev. So in Eucharistic local context, Eucharistic perspective as ecclesiology, this is not just a conflict of universal jurisdiction, but a problem of pastoral care. And I think in this case, the perspective could change. And we, all churches, I think, have to regain trust with each other. The third remark, the local level is so important because they understand each other better. The problem of the dialogue of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the final point which was explained very well by Professor Krawchuk, inside also a broader context of dialogue in the association of Council of Ukrainian Churches and the Religious Association is very helpful. But I see also a risk that this dialogue between two similar structures, two similar churches, which has similar histories and also similar pleasures and problems, could be an exclusive dialogue. It should not be exclusive, but inclusive, not just a good level of mutual understanding and cutting out the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, the other churches. So the local level should be always open to the other churches. I would not say the universal level in a sense of pyramidal power, but the other churches in a communion of churches. And I think this is the challenge. The challenges that all the churches face now, and in a dramatic way when we are also Christians, the churches bear a responsibility before the world for the war which is in Minas, which is always on the horizon of our days.
Thank you very much, Professor Mainardi, for your comments. I was taking notes as you were speaking. I think the first point about the Greek Catholic Church not being part of the international dialogues, I of course, that's part of my discussion. But as I moved in my thinking about this, I'm not sure. Again, I'm just observing things and trying to analyze things, and the churches will decide for themselves what they want to ask for, what they want to do. I'm not sure that the Greek Catholic Church needs to be sitting in the same room in the international dialogues. If it is a problem still for the Orthodox side, then I don't think it's a problem for the Greek Catholics to participate in other ways. They can be consulted. They can be consulted on if the issue of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church comes up again in discussion, it is appropriate for there to be some consultation about the Greek Catholic Church. Otherwise, the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, is perfectly able to represent the whole Catholic world, you know, in all other questions, theological, liturgical, canonical, what have you. So I'm not sure that that there's a problem, you know, of exclusion in that way. I think I might need to refine a little bit what I'm talking about when I say, but I did say that, you know, if there's a discussion of Ukraine, explicit or implicit, in 1993, the problem of uniatism in Catholic Orthodox international discussions was necessitated by the situation in Ukraine. This is clear to me. I mean, there's other Eastern Catholics around. There's issues that Orthodox have with uniatism in general, But in 1993 and the years before, there were conferences before, Freising and so on, Aricia, all these other meetings that were taken, and the US Conference of Catholic Bishops was also discussing Uniatism. Uniatism was being discussed in the United States, if you can imagine, in the early 1990s. Why all these conferences? There's a whole long list. It's only because of the the fall of the Soviet Union and the changed situation. So, I mean, if that kind of discussion is taking place, all I'm saying, this is the only point that I'm making, is it makes sense to have some consultation, at least on the side, with the people who are being talked about. So that's all I would say about that. I'm not sure that it's necessary to push for, a presence of, because if it causes problems with some Orthodox, if it causes everybody to stand up and go to church and pray, about what to do, then it's not worth it, So. As far as healing memories, I think you're absolutely right. The transition and the transfer of parishes in the early 90s, when the Greek Catholic Church became legal and came out of the underground, and other, some parishes were Russian Orthodox, and the priest himself said, Father Yaroslav Chukny was the first in Lviv to say, I have listened to enough confessions to understand where the will of my parish is. Maybe there was not a single parish in Western Ukraine with 100% consensus. Maybe 100% consensus is not possible, So there's always somebody, pushing and so. Of course, there were issues that took place, and there are issues now with transfers to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. But I think these things have to be monitored. These things have to be within the law, and nobody is declaring some kind of religious war against another denomination. I think you're absolutely right when you say that you don't heal one schism by entering into another one. I think the other reflection there is that this is also one of the points of affinity between the two churches that I was talking about, both from the point of view of Moscow or schismatic. I mean, both found their own path, which involved the first step of separating from Moscow. Both caused pain to the Moscow Patriarchate. The church is losing its own members. It's a painful situation. It's described by the person who is experiencing this loss. It's called a schism. So I understand from the point of view of not just the canon law, but the psychology of it, So I full agreement there. The healing of memories, again, on the local and grassroots level. I think this is a very interesting point you made about the Eucharistic theology, and that it's not just jurisdictional matters, but pastoral issues. I thought, from the point of view, not of the Moscow Patriarchate, but from the point of view of the ecumenical, from the point of view of two communities in Ukraine that for decades were pariahs, were shunned, were uncanonical. Nobody wanted to speak to them. Nobody wanted to recognize their Christianity. I think of not the canonical or the jurisdictional, or I think about, again, the human level, the hearts, whatever, what kind of pain, what kind of trauma this means to carry around it. You're walking around in the world and you live in your own country. You are legal according to the law, but this majority church is saying, well, I have the footnote where everybody knows the story about the boy who did not have the funeral because he was baptized in another jurisdiction. You know, it's one thing to have very strong convictions and be loyal to your canon law and so on. I think, again, on the ground, you're forced to consider the human reality of the pain that is caused by these situations. So I think I absolutely agree. And the point that I was getting at with Patriarch Bartholomew is I put the question in the following way. When you look at these two communities, which now are canonical, and they became, you know, they joined to become the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and they think, okay, we're a church, we have to organize ourselves because we just unified, we have to consolidate and make plans for the future. What is going to be our model of ecclesiology? Are we going to be guided by canons and jurisdictional debates and historical kind of interpretations of history that are irreconcilable, you know, this kind of thing? Or are we going to be guided by the pastoral embrace that Patriarch Bartholomew gave to us and said, look, you had some problems, but we accept you. We accept you and we will work with you and we will regularize your situation in the world so you don't have to walk in shame or walk in pain or something of that sort. So I just put, it's a more of a rhetorical question, you know. It seems to me that the people who were living for all these decades in this, you know, it's probably a worse situation than the Uniates were, you know. Because nobody was, the Uniates have the Roman Catholic Church, which recognized full communion, no problem. But these people in the Orthodox communion, they didn't want to be Catholic, they want to be Orthodox. They did not have that recognition. And I think the answer to the question is that the moment of reception, it's not just a schism, you know, that you can call it that from a canonical point of view, but the other side of it is that they are being embraced by someone who accepts them. So it's not a plan to divide churches. It's an acceptance and a regularization of life of people who lived for decades in you know, we mentioned an untenable situation. Well, that was also a very untenable, difficult, psychologically difficult situation. So I thank you for that. And I also fully agree with you that that any kind of dialogue, again, it's my own, I'm not prescribing, you know, or telling people what they should be doing. I'm looking at what the possibilities are. I'm trying to size up the problems, and I'm trying to say, hey, here's what Father Cyril Havorun is saying from the Russian Orthodox. Here is what Metropolitan Shepsitsky said. Here is what some other Orthodox are saying. They are saying very similar things about inclusion, about the dangers of philitism, about unity and reconciliation. So the dialogue can begin, you know, between people who understand each other, who you don't have to convince to come to the dialogue table because they don't want to come. You have to convince. That's a separate effort. That's a separate project. But people who are already in the same space or you know, understand many things in the same way, they are natural dialogue partners. So I think it's a matter of concern. I think Father Bortnyk was mentioning the other time that there is not now a dialogue happening, but I think there are possibilities for it. And what I'm agreeing with you is it should not be exclusive. It can begin there and be open at all times to something greater. But again, Father Bortnyk correctly mentioned in the discussion last time that we had, is that conversations that take place in the Council of Churches and religious organizations. This is not directly a theological discussion. This is matters of public policy, laws that are coming up, and so on, trying to develop a common position. I would argue to that in fact, when you are making representations to the government or to the parliament of Ukraine about what the common position of all religions are, you are in fact consulting your theological tradition in order to make sense of the reality and to figure out what your priorities are. You have to do that. But strictly speaking, it is not a theology, a theological discussion about, I don't know, the interpretation of the Bible or the interpretation of canons or liturgical texts or other things, or even a theology that is like a social ethics or something. I think those discussions can take place and should take place. I would also add that it would be very good. It was part of my question to Father Bortnyk last time about the extent to which there is cooperation across the denominations in terms of what kind of priests are being educated in Ukraine. Ukraine is a place where Orthodox and Catholic and Greek Catholic coexist. Nobody is raising the uniate question for nobody in Ukraine that I know of. Say, oh, we can't have the uniates. There's the Council of Churches, no problem. They meet, for decades, no problem. They issue statements together. They sign them together. Moscow Patriarchate, Ukrainian churches, Greek Catholic, Baptists, and so on, others. I think, again, we come back to what I was saying before in response to Professor Bairactaris, that there's a very particular situation in Ukraine which is rich with opportunities for ecumenical dialogue. But again, it's the local questions, it's a local conversation, people meeting people. It can provide information to the larger international context, but it doesn't replace it.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite other people that listen to our lecture and to our discussion. If you have questions or some ideas, you can ask and tell us your ideas, please.
At least a short comment by the two members, one of from the evangelical tradition and the other from the ecumenical monastery of Bose, at least to say a word.
I think Father Lino just left the webinar, I think.
We can see Dagmar Heller, I suppose, can listen to us.
Okay.
If you have some.
In that case, the time is over. Let me express my sincere gratitude for a wonderful discussion. Many things can be said to take an hour more, but the time is running. And Sergei, you are now to close the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Dagmar is here.
Yes, thank you. But I came a bit late, so therefore I cannot say too much. But I'm glad to see you all. So I listened to you. I just put on my video now so that you can see me at least some minutes. Thank you.
Thank you too. So if you have no other questions, I would like to say thanks for our Professor Andrii Krawchuk. He is of the Ukrainian origin, and he is interested in the things that are happening in Ukraine. And it is very important for me as representative of Ukraine, as a person that lives in Ukraine. And the only thing I wanted to mention is that in Ukraine we have more large churches as only these two churches, Greek Catholic Church and Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And I suppose this affinity you have mentioned is also connected to the idea that both of them have more or less a center in Galicia. For example, in Eastern Ukraine or in South Ukraine, both denominations have not really many parishes. That's why if we speak about Ukraine as a whole, it would be maybe interesting to mention also this Ukrainian Orthodox Church that is connected to the Moscow Patriarchate. But in any way, thank you very much. And I hope that it was interesting for the listeners. It was also interesting for you, Professor Krawchuk, to listen to us. And I hope that this kind of cooperation, this kind of dialogue will be also in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Vasilios, do you have a minute? Can we talk for a bit? Petros, sorry.
1 minute, yeah.
1 minute, okay. So I will revise the text. I will send it to you in a day or two, if that's okay.
Fine.
And I just wanted to ask the upcoming, we have Friday presentation coming up.
Friday is a Greek speaking.
Oh, I see.
For the Greeks.
And the one from last Friday was, is that?
Was transferred to this Friday.
Oh, I see. Okay. But there was a.
And then on 1st of March, we have an English lecture by Reverend Dr. Georgios Baskiudis on Alexander Schumann contribution to the ecumenical theology. So this is also, this will be announced. Everything will be announced.
Okay.
But anyhow, I thank you very much for this wonderful exchange tonight.
Thank you again once more, and thank you all for all the participants. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.